Meeting Sophia's family for the first time felt like walking onto a stage where everyone already knew their lines, except me. We'd been together for 3 years by that point, and although I'd brought her home to meet my family within the first year, she had always found reasons to put off introducing me to hers. "They're just private," she'd say with a tight smile. "You'll understand when you meet them." When the day finally came, I was ready to be on my best behavior. Her parents lived in a pristine suburban neighborhood straight out of a magazine. Every house looked the same, with identical manicured lawns, white picket fences, and potted flowers lining the walkways. Their home was no different, impeccable, down to the faint scent of lavender that hit me as Sophia opened the door. Her parents greeted us with wide smiles and open arms, but something about their warmth felt rehearsed, like they'd practiced it in front of a mirror. "Welcome, welcome," her mother chirped, enveloping me in a hug before I could even introduce myself. Her father followed with a firm handshake, his grin almost too perfect. They wasted no time asking about my job, my family, my hobbies, anything and everything. At first, I was flattered by their interest, but as the questions kept coming, it started to feel more like an interrogation. Sophia, on the other hand, seemed on edge. She hovered near her parents, cutting off certain topics with nervous laughter and redirecting the conversation with a finesse I hadn't seen before. When her dad asked about my childhood, she jumped in before I could answer. "Oh, he's told me all about it," she said, her voice high-pitched and forced. "It's such a sweet story, isn't it, Mom?" Her mom nodded enthusiastically, as though they'd rehearsed this moment too. I chalked up her behavior to nerves. After all, meeting someone's family can be stressful, and Sophia had always been a bit private about her upbringing. Still, the tension in the room was hard to ignore. It wasn't hostile, far from it, but there was a stiffness to their smiles, a hollowness in their laughter that didn't quite match Sophia's usual reserved demeanor. And then there was Ethan. Sophia had mentioned her brother in passing before, but never in detail. All I knew was that he'd been living abroad for years and had recently moved back to town. He arrived halfway through dinner, bursting through the door with a boisterous energy that instantly filled the room. Tall and broad-shouldered, he had an easy charm that stood in stark contrast to the tightly wound atmosphere of the house. "Sorry I'm late," he exclaimed, shrugging off his jacket. Traffic was a nightmare. As soon as he sat down, the dynamic shifted. He had a way of making everyone relax, cracking jokes that actually landed and steering the conversation in a way that felt effortless. I liked him immediately. By the end of the night, we bonded over football, trading stats and predictions like old friends. "You're a good one," he said, clapping me on the back as we said our goodbyes. Sophia did well. On the drive home, Sophia was unusually quiet. I glanced over at her, squeezing her hand gently. "Your family's great," I said, hoping to ease whatever was bothering her. "I can see where you get it from." She smiled faintly, but didn't say much. After a long pause, she finally spoke. "They liked you," she said, her voice softer than usual. "That's all that matters." As we pulled into my driveway, she turned to me, her expression unreadable. "See," she said almost to herself. "I told you they'd love you." At the time, I thought she was just nervous about blending our worlds. I had no idea what was really going on beneath the surface. Looking back, though, the cracks were already there. I just didn't know how to see them yet. The first few weeks after meeting Sophia's family felt like a dream. Her parents checked in occasionally, sending texts or inviting us over for Sunday lunch. Ethan, however, became a constant presence, slipping into my life with an ease that made it feel like he'd always been there. He was the kind of guy who could turn any gathering into a good time, his charm effortless and disarming. "Mind if I join?" he'd ask, showing up unannounced with a bag of takeout or a six-pack of beer. I didn't mind. In fact, I welcomed it. Growing up as an only child, I'd always envied people with siblings. Someone to share jokes with, someone who'd have your back. Ethan filled that void seamlessly. Fishing trips became our thing. He'd text me on weekends with plans to hit the lake before sunrise. I wasn't much of an outdoorsman, but with Ethan, it didn't matter. We'd sit in the quiet morning air, swapping stories about college or laughing about the one time I'd accidentally capsized the canoe. "You're like the brother I never had," I told him one day as we packed up. His grin was genuine, and he clapped me on the back. That's what family's for. Over time, Ethan wasn't just someone I saw on weekends. He became a fixture in our day-to-day lives. When Sophia and I decided to redecorate the living room, he was there, offering advice on color schemes and helping us pick out the couch. When our car broke down on the side of the highway, Ethan was the first person I called. He arrived within minutes, cracking jokes as he hooked up the jumper cables. "I'm telling you," he said, You two would be lost without me. At the time, I thought his involvement was a sign of genuine camaraderie. He wasn't just Sophia's brother. He was becoming one of my closest friends. But looking back now, I can't help but wonder if it was all part of a larger plan. Ethan didn't just insert himself into our lives. He embedded himself, weaving his presence into every detail of our day-to-day existence. And I didn't question it. Why would I? He was Sophia's brother. He was family. The proposal came on a snowy December evening. I'd planned the entire thing down to the last detail. A secluded spot in the park, fairy lights strung along the trees, and a box holding the ring I'd picked out months earlier. When I got down on one knee and asked Sophia to marry me, her eyes filled with tears, and she said yes without hesitation. It was one of the happiest moments of my life. Ethan was the first person we told. We stopped by his apartment that night, barely able to contain our excitement. When Sophia flashed the ring, Ethan whooped loudly and pulled us both into a hug. "I knew it was coming," he said, beaming. "You two are perfect for each other." His enthusiasm was infectious, and I couldn't have asked for a better reaction. From that point on, Ethan threw himself into the wedding planning process with a level of energy that rivaled Sophia's. He volunteered to help with everything, from scoping out venues to coordinating with vendors. "Let me take some of the stress off your plate," he'd say, brushing off my protests. "You've got enough to worry about." At first, I thought he was just being supportive. But as the months went on, his involvement became almost overbearing. He wasn't just helping, he was taking over. From the guest list to the menu, Ethan seemed to have an opinion on everything. "Ethan just wants the day to be perfect," Sophia reassured me when I voiced my concerns. And I believed her. After all, Ethan had proven time and time again that he had our best interests at heart. Why wouldn't I trust him? At first, it was easy to ignore the inconsistencies. Sophia's family seemed perfectly pleasant, and I had no reason to dig deeper. But as the months rolled on, small cracks began to show. Her parents, always warm and welcoming, rarely talked about their past. Whenever I asked simple questions, where they'd lived before moving to their current home, what her dad had done during his supposed career in tech, the answers were vague or contradictory. "Oh, we moved around a lot," her mom would say, waving a hand dismissively. "You know how it is?" Her dad, meanwhile, would launch into anecdotes that never quite added up. One time he mentioned retiring early because his company had gone public. Another time he claimed to have sold it outright. When I pressed for details, he'd chuckle and change the subject. I found it odd, but I didn't dwell on it. After all, not everyone loves talking about themselves. Sophia seemed unconcerned. "They're just private people," she told me when I brought it up. "They've had a lot of ups and downs. I think they're just trying to focus on the present." Her explanation made sense, sort of. I wanted to believe her, but the unease lingered. Then there was Ethan. For someone who'd supposedly spent years abroad, his backstory was oddly thin. When I asked where he'd lived, he'd rattle off the names of countries but couldn't seem to name a single city. "Oh, you know," he'd say with a shrug. "I was always moving around. Didn't really settle anywhere for long." His reasons for coming back were even murkier. "Just time for a change," he told me when I asked. "Needed to be closer to family." It wasn't exactly suspicious, but it felt incomplete. And for a guy as chatty and charming as Ethan, his reluctance to share details stood out. I mentioned it to Sophia one night while we were brushing our teeth. "Doesn't it seem weird that Ethan never talks about his time abroad?" She frowned at me in the mirror. "What's weird about it? Not everyone likes reliving the past. Honestly, I think he's just happy to be home." Her tone was sharp enough to end the conversation, but the seed of doubt had already taken root. The unease grew stronger one night when Ethan came over to watch the game. Normally, he was the life of the party, cracking jokes and yelling at the TV like it was a direct line to the coach. But that night, he seemed distracted. He kept checking his phone, his face tight with concentration. "Everything okay?" I asked during a commercial break. Yeah, he said, waving me off. "Just some work stuff. Don't worry about it." At halftime, he excused himself to take a call. The walls in our apartment were thin, and though I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, snippets of his conversation drifted through the air. "No, it's fine," I heard him say. "Just stick to the plan. We're almost there." My stomach tightened. What plan? Who was he talking to? When he came back, his easygoing demeanor had returned, but I couldn't shake the tension from his earlier call. "Everything good?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "Yeah," he said with a grin, plopping back onto the couch. "Just work drama. You know how it is." I wanted to believe him, so I did. After all, what reason did I have to suspect otherwise? He was Sophia's brother, someone who'd become like family to me. And yet, that moment stayed with me. It felt like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit, a small, nagging detail that refused to be ignored. I told myself it was nothing. It had to be nothing. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As the wedding drew closer, it felt like my life had become a whirlwind of tastings, fittings, and endless conversations about centerpieces. The excitement was undeniable, but the stress was just as real. Sophia and I barely had time to catch our breath, and Ethan, true to form, stepped in to help. If I wasn't in a meeting with a vendor, Ethan was. If Sophia was too busy to deal with seating arrangements, Ethan had already handled it. It was impressive, almost too much so. Ethan's a godsend, Sophia said one night as we collapsed onto the couch after a long day. I don't know how we'd do this without him. I nodded, though a flicker of unease crept into my mind. Ethan's involvement was almost obsessive. He wasn't just helping, he was taking charge. From the catering menu to the flower arrangements, he seemed to have his hands in every detail. When I brought it up, Sophia brushed it off. He just wants the day to be perfect, she said. You know how much he loves us? That explanation worked for a while, but the small inconsistencies I noticed before were starting to add up. One evening, I sat down to review the guest list. As I scanned through the names, a pattern emerged. I didn't recognize most of the people on Sophia's side. Hey, I called out to Sophia, who was folding laundry in the other room. Who are these people? Barbara Linton? Gregor Hayes? I don't think I've ever heard you mention them. Sophia appeared in the doorway, her smile tight. They're distant relatives, she said quickly. My mom insisted on inviting them. You'll meet them at the wedding. Her response felt rehearsed, but I didn't press her. I wanted to believe her. After all, what reason would she have to lie about something like that? Still, a nagging voice in the back of my mind wouldn't let it go. Meanwhile, Ethan seemed to be everywhere at once. One evening, as I was finishing some work in the dining room, I heard him on the phone in the kitchen, speaking in a low, urgent tone. No, it's fine, he said. I'll take care of it. Just make sure everything's ready on your end. When he noticed me standing in the doorway, he hung up abruptly, flashing me his signature grin. Just vendor stuff, he said casually. These people are a nightmare to work with. I forced a smile, but the moment stayed with me. Ethan had always been smooth, but there was something about his demeanor lately, an edge I couldn't quite put my finger on. You're going above and beyond, I told him during one of our late-night planning sessions, trying to keep the tone light. Hey, your family now, he said, clapping me on the back. This is what we do. For a while, that reassurance was enough. Ethan had proven himself over and over again. Why would now be any different? But as the wedding day loomed closer, the cracks in the facade were becoming harder to ignore. The morning of the wedding felt surreal, like walking through a dream. The venue was breathtaking, bathed in soft sunlight that filtered through towering trees and highlighted the sea of white flowers adorning the altar. Guests began arriving early, each dressed impeccably, their faces glowing with excitement. I could hear the hum of laughter and conversation as I adjusted my tie in the small waiting room off to the side. Today was supposed to be perfect, the culmination of years of love and planning. Sophia looked radiant when I saw her in her dress. Her smile was wide, but there was something else behind her eyes, a flicker of nervous energy that I chalked up to pre-wedding jitters. She gripped my hand tightly before the ceremony, whispering, "This is it. We're really doing this." Ethan was already at the venue when I arrived, coordinating with the vendors as though it was his wedding. "Relax, man," he said, patting me on the shoulder. "I've got everything under control. Just focus on Sophia." His smile was as easy as ever, but I couldn't help but notice he avoided eye contact for just a fraction of a second too long. The ceremony began right on schedule. I stood at the altar, my heart racing as the music swelled and the crowd turned to watch Sophia make her way down the aisle. She was breathtaking, her movements graceful and deliberate, her gaze locked on mine. For a moment, all the doubts, all the red flags, melted away. This was the woman I loved, and I was ready to spend the rest of my life with her. Ethan stood off to the side, his posture relaxed but his expression unusually solemn. He caught my eye and gave me a subtle thumbs up, as if to say, "You've got this." It was the last thing I needed to steady my nerves. Just as the officiant opened his mouth to begin, the doors to the hall burst open with a deafening crash. The sound was enough to jolt everyone out of their seats. Heads turned in unison to the source of the commotion. A young woman stormed in, her hair wild, her face flushed, and her voice shaking as she yelled, "Stop! Stop the wedding!" The room fell silent, the joyful buzz replaced by a suffocating tension. My heart stopped as the woman marched forward, her heels clicking loudly against the marble floor. Sophia froze beside me, her grip on my arm tightening painfully. "Who the hell is that?" someone whispered from the crowd. The woman didn't waste any time. She pointed directly at Ethan, her finger trembling with rage. "That man," she said, her voice rising to fill the room, "is a liar and a thief. He stole from me everything I had and disappeared." Gasps rippled through the crowd, and I felt the floor drop out from beneath me. My gaze snapped to Ethan, whose confident expression faltered for the first time. His usually easy demeanor cracked, replaced by something I'd never seen on his face before: panic. "What is this?" I managed to stammer, my voice barely audible. The woman turned to me, her eyes filled with fury and desperation. "He's not who you think he is," she said, her words slicing through the air. "None of them are. They're con artists. All of them." I looked at Sophia, hoping for some sign of disbelief, of denial. But instead, her face was pale, her lips pressed into a tight line. She wasn't shocked. She wasn't confused. She knew. In that moment, everything I thought I knew about my life unraveled. The woman's words hung in the air, a wrecking ball swinging through the fragile illusion I had built my life around. "He's not her brother. They're lovers. And they're con artists." The sentence replayed in my mind as the room erupted into chaos. Guests gasped, murmuring among themselves, some standing to get a better view of the unfolding disaster. My legs felt rooted to the spot, the weight of her accusations pressing down on me like an anchor. I turned to Sophia, desperate for her to say something, anything that would make it all go away. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, and her mouth slightly open as if she were trying to form words. But there was no denial, no outrage, no protest. Instead, there was guilt, a deep, unmistakable guilt that hit me harder than any words ever could. "Is this true?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Sophia, tell me this isn't true." My tone was more pleading than accusatory, as if I could will her into giving me the answer I wanted. But she just stood there, frozen, her hand slipping from mine as I pulled away. The woman wasn't done. "His name isn't Ethan," she continued, her voice rising above the growing murmur of the crowd. "And hers isn't Sophia. I knew something was off when I saw their engagement announcement online. They've done this before, to me and to God knows how many others." She held up her phone, scrolling through what looked like old photos. "Here, this is him, and this. That's her. Different names, same scam." I stared at the pictures as she held them up for the room to see. Ethan, if that was even his name, looked slightly younger, but unmistakable. And Sophia, or whoever she was standing beside him, laughing, arm in arm like a couple on a carefree vacation. The pieces began to click into place, and it was like a dam bursting in my mind. The evasive answers about their past. The perfectly curated family dynamic. Ethan's over-the-top involvement in our lives. Every small red flag I'd brushed aside suddenly came rushing back, each one screaming the truth I had refused to see. The woman's gaze shifted to me, her expression softening. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice quieter now. "But you need to know who they really are. They've done this before. They lure people in, get close, take everything, and then disappear." I turned back to Sophia, or whoever she was. "Tell me it's not true," I whispered, my voice cracking. "Please." For a moment, she looked like she might speak. Her lips parted, and she reached out toward me as if to comfort me. But then her hand dropped, and her eyes fell to the floor. Her silence was deafening, an answer louder than any word she could have spoken. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. The woman I'd planned to marry, the person I thought I knew better than anyone else in the world, was a stranger, a liar, a thief, and I was her latest mark. Ethan, or whatever his real name was, tried to step in, raising his hands in a gesture of calm. Okay, he said, his voice strained but still unervingly smooth. "This is just a misunderstanding. Let's all take a breath and talk this through." The woman rounded on him. "Talk this through? You destroyed my life," she shouted. "You drained my bank account, maxed out my credit cards, and left me with nothing. And now you're doing it to him." She pointed at me, her voice shaking. "How much have you taken already?" I felt every set of eyes in the room shift toward me, waiting for my response. But I couldn't speak. My mind was spinning, torn between disbelief and the horrible realization that I'd been living in a lie for years. And the worst part? I had no idea how much of my life they'd already stolen, or how close they'd come to taking the rest. The room descended into chaos almost immediately. Guests murmured in hushed tones, their voices rising with every new accusation hurled by the woman who had crashed my wedding. Some stood frozen in disbelief, their faces painted with shock, while others turned to each other, whispering questions and theories. A few bold souls shouted demands for answers, their voices cutting through the cacophony like a blade. Ethan, or whatever his real name was, moved toward the exit, his posture tense but his face calm. He still had that practiced charm, though cracks were beginning to show. "All right, everyone, let's not blow this out of proportion," he said, holding up his hands in mock surrender. "It's just a misunderstanding." But before he could make it to the door, two of my friends, Joe and Marcus, stepped in front of him. Joe crossed his arms, glaring at Ethan like he was ready to take a swing. "You're not going anywhere," Joe said, his voice low and threatening. Ethan's eyes darted around the room, looking for an escape route. "Listen," he stammered, his smooth facade slipping. "This isn't what it looks like. Save it," Marcus snapped. "You're not talking your way out of this." Sophia stood frozen near the altar, her face streaked with tears. She finally turned to me, her voice trembling. "I can explain," she said, stepping toward me with her hands outstretched. "It's not what you think." I stepped back instinctively, the distance between us feeling like an uncrossable chasm. "Not what I think," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Then tell me, Sophia, or whoever you are, what exactly is it?" She flinched, her tears falling faster. "It's complicated," she said, her voice breaking. "Please just let me explain." But I couldn't hear her. The betrayal was too much, cutting deeper than I thought possible. The woman I had loved, trusted, and planned to marry had been lying to me for years. Every smile, every kiss, every moment we'd shared, it was all tainted now, poisoned by the knowledge that I was nothing more than a mark to her. "I don't want to hear it," I said coldly, my voice steadier than I expected. "Not now." The police arrived not long after, summoned by someone in the crowd. Two officers entered the hall, their presence commanding enough to quiet the chaos. They quickly assessed the situation, speaking to the woman who had crashed the wedding while keeping an eye on Ethan and Sophia. Ethan tried to charm his way out of it, flashing a disarming smile. "Officers, I think there's been a misunderstanding," he began, but one of the officers cut him off. "Save it for the station," the officer said, his tone sharp. Sophia didn't resist as they approached her. She didn't say a word as they placed handcuffs on her wrists, her tears falling silently onto the white fabric of her dress. She looked at me one last time as they led her away, her eyes pleading for understanding, for forgiveness. But I couldn't give her that. Not now. Maybe not ever. As the police escorted Ethan and Sophia out of the hall, the weight of what had just happened began to settle in. I was left standing at the altar, surrounded by the shattered remains of what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. The guests stared at me, their faces a mixture of pity and disbelief, but none of them spoke. For a long moment, I stood there in silence, staring at the floor as the reality of the situation washed over me. The love of my life was gone, exposed as a fraud. The family I thought I gained had never been real, and the future I had envisioned was now nothing more than a cruel, distant dream. In the days that followed, the reality of what had happened hit me like a slow-moving avalanche. The immediate chaos of the wedding was over, but the fallout lingered in every corner of my life. My house, my finances, my entire sense of security, it had all been violated. Sophia and her so-called family had woven themselves into every aspect of my existence, leaving no part untouched. It was like waking up to find your home ransacked, only to realize the intruders had been living with you all along. I spent hours going through my accounts, combing for signs of the damage they'd done. Credit cards I didn't remember applying for. A drained savings account with a series of mysterious withdrawals labeled as miscellaneous expenses. Even my mortgage had been tampered with, refinanced without my knowledge, likely to funnel money somewhere I'd never see again. Thankfully, I discovered the truth before the wedding. If the ceremony had gone through, I could have been on the hook for everything. Debts I didn't accrue, contracts I didn't sign, a life completely hollowed out. But even catching it in time didn't feel like a victory. The damage was still immense, and worse, it was personal. Friends and family tried their best to console me in the aftermath, but their words only added to the noise in my head. They asked the same questions I'd been torturing myself with. How did you not see it? Didn't anything seem off? What about the brother? Didn't he seem too involved? Their pity felt like a spotlight on my own failures. The truth was, I had seen the signs, but I'd ignored them. I'd brushed off the vague stories about Sophia's past, laughed away the inconsistencies in her parents' lives, and rationalized Ethan's overbearing presence as sibling affection. Each red flag had been small enough to dismiss on its own, but together, they painted a picture I couldn't unsee. Every night, I lay awake, replaying those moments in my head. Ethan's knowing smirks, Sophia's tight-lipped answers about her childhood, the strange phone calls, and the guests on the wedding list I'd never met. Each memory felt like a slap, a reminder of how blind I'd been, how easily I'd been fooled. But what haunted me most wasn't the scam itself. It wasn't the money or the elaborate lies, or even the public humiliation of having my wedding crash land into a disaster. It was the emotional betrayal, the realization that the woman I had loved, trusted, and shared my life with had never been real. Sophia had been my partner in every way that mattered. She knew my quirks, my fears, my dreams. She'd been there on my best days and my worst, always with a smile or a comforting word. And yet, none of it had been genuine. Her affection, her laughter, her love, it was all part of the con. That was the hardest part to reconcile. The Sophia I had loved was a mirage, a role she played so convincingly that I believed in her completely. Now, I had to accept that she'd never existed at all. People told me I was lucky, that I dodged a bullet by finding out the truth before it was too late. But it didn't feel like luck. It felt like loss. Immense, gut-wrenching loss. And I wasn't sure how to move forward from that. Word of the wedding disaster spread faster than I expected. By the next morning, my phone was buzzing nonstop with messages from friends, acquaintances, and even distant family members who had heard whispers of what happened. Some reached out with genuine sympathy, offering their support and asking if I needed anything. Others, less tactfully, wanted details, juicy tidbits to fill in the blanks of a scandal they'd no doubt share at their next dinner party. I heard it was her brother, one old college friend texted. But he's not actually her brother? WTF, man. Are you okay? The attention was overwhelming. I became a living, breathing cautionary tale, a reminder of how easily trust could be exploited. The story seemed to take on a life of its own, morphing into something more dramatic and salacious with each retelling. By the end of the week, I'd stopped responding to messages altogether, letting the notifications pile up like unread junk mail. The police investigation uncovered more than I ever wanted to know. Sophia and Ethan, if those were even their real names, had been running their con for years. Their parents were accomplices, actors who had perfected their roles as doting in-laws to disarm their marks. Together, they had lured in unsuspecting victims, gained their trust, and systematically drained them of their finances before disappearing. I wasn't the first, and I likely wouldn't be the last. The police linked them to at least 5 other victims, each with a similar story: whirlwind romance, a too-good-to-be-true family, and financial devastation left in their wake. Hearing those stories was both validating and horrifying. On one hand, it proved I wasn't alone. On the other, it underscored just how calculated and heartless they were. One victim, a woman named Rebecca, reached out to me through the police. She'd been engaged to Ethan years earlier, only to discover his betrayal after he'd wiped out her savings. They're professionals, she told me over the phone, her voice brittle with pain. They know exactly how to make you trust them. Don't blame yourself for falling for it. Her words were meant to comfort me, but they only deepened my anger. How many lives had they destroyed? How many people had they left in ruins? And for what money? Power? The thrill of getting away with it? In the weeks that followed, I tried to piece my life back together. I threw myself into work, taking on extra projects, and staying late at the office to avoid the empty silence of my home. I deleted photos, packed away mementos, and avoided anything that reminded me of Sophia or the life we'd almost built together. But moving on wasn't as simple as cutting ties. The scars she left weren't just emotional. They were tangible. My finances were still a mess, my accounts tangled in fraudulent activity that would take months to untangle. But the deeper wounds were the ones no bank or lawyer could fix. Trust, once so freely given, now felt impossible. Every new person I met, every friendly smile or kind gesture, triggered a wave of suspicion. What were their motives? Were they genuine? Or was I just setting myself up to be hurt again? I knew I couldn't live like that forever, but I also couldn't pretend the betrayal hadn't changed me. Sophia and Ethan had turned my world upside down, and while the pieces were slowly falling back into place, they would never fit together the same way again. Months after the wedding that wasn't, life had settled into a strange rhythm. The chaos had faded, but in its place was a quiet, heavy kind of emptiness. My days were consumed by work and the slow, tedious process of untangling my finances from the wreckage Sophia and Ethan had left behind. Nights were harder. The silence of my house felt suffocating, a constant reminder of the life I'd almost stepped into and the woman who had stolen it from me. One evening, as I sifted through a pile of mail, I froze. Among the usual bills and junk mail was a plain envelope with no return address. My name was scrawled across the front in handwriting I recognized instantly, hers. Sophia. I stared at the envelope for what felt like hours, the room around me fading into the background. My first instinct was to throw it away, to toss it into the trash, and pretend it had never arrived. But something stopped me. A morbid curiosity, maybe, or the lingering part of me that still wanted answers. Why had she done it? Was any part of it real? Or was this just another manipulation? One last attempt to worm her way back into my head? I sat at the kitchen table, the envelope in front of me like a ticking time bomb. My hands hovered over it, trembling slightly, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. The wounds she'd left were still too fresh, the betrayal still too raw. What could she possibly say that would make a difference? No apology could undo the damage. No explanation could erase the years of lies. And yet, the thought of leaving the letter unopened felt like letting her win. Like letting her hold onto the last word in a story that should have ended months ago. I tore the envelope open halfway before stopping, the edges of the paper frayed where I'd hesitated. I stared at it, willing myself to either finish or walk away. Finally, with a deep breath, I folded the envelope closed again and tucked it into the back of a drawer. Not today. Maybe someday I'd find the strength to read it. Maybe not. Either way, I knew that whatever was inside wouldn't change the truth of what had happened, or the person I needed to become to move forward. The trust I'd lost might never fully return. Every new relationship, every connection, would carry the weight of this betrayal. But for the first time in months, I felt a faint glimmer of something I hadn't allowed myself to feel. Relief. I had survived. I had walked through the fire and come out scarred but alive,